Hello, everybody. I feel that introduction makes me sound much more impressive than I probably am, but I hope you'll find something of interest for the next few minutes. So yes, I'm Andrew Dunn. I'm the publishing editor for the Journal Royal Society of Open Science, and Leonard and Elizabeth have very kindly invited me to talk a little bit today about peer review and kind of opening up that black box for those who perhaps aren't so familiar with the process. I'm conscious that time is relatively short today, so I'm going to try and keep this quite quick, but I'm also conscious that I have been known to speak quite quickly. So if at any point I am speaking more quickly than is comfortable, please do put something in the chat and I shall try to rein in my natural enthusiasm. But okay, without further ado then, if I can show my presentation to work, of course. There we go. I thought I'd start with a very quick introduction about what the Royal Society is. The Royal Society of Open Science is published by the Royal Society. And as the slide kind of lays out here, with the UK's National Scientific Academy, which I believe is roughly the analogue to the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. I hope you'll forgive me if I don't try and pronounce that in Dutch. I don't think it will end very well. But the Royal Society is a self-governing fellowship of about 1,600, I think, of the world's most eminent scientists from all of the sort of STEM subjects. Fellows included figures such as Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and more recently figures such as Jennifer Doudna, who won a Nobel Prize a few years ago. The mission of the Society, again, is laid out on the slide, is promote, recognise and support excellence in science. And we do that through a number of mechanisms: scientific meetings, public events such as our flagship Summer Science Exhibition. We have a very active policy and grants programme, but most pertinently for today's activities, we publish a number of journals. Indeed, we publish 10 journals that cover the full range of the life and physical sciences, and we have a journal, Notes and Records, that covers the history of science. And these journals kind of operate a number of different ways to achieve those goals. But for brief interest, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society A and B are the world's oldest continuously published journals, first published in 1665, I believe. But all those journals have kind of one thing in common, and that's the process of peer review as a form of quality assurance process to make sure that papers submitted to the journals are right when they are published, that they are accurate and scientifically sound and potentially have some form of impact. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes on in the peer review process. So for those who are familiar with sort of journal publication and perhaps writing research, the life cycle broadly of the research process is you'll get your grant funding, you'll conduct your research, turn it into a research paper or a research manuscript, submission, article. I'll use all those words essentially interchangeably. It'll essentially just mean the thing you're packaging from your research to submit to a journal for publication. The output, that manuscript, will go into a journal's peer review black box, and then a period of time later, ranging from days, weeks, potentially months, or in some cases years later, you will receive an editorial decision, one of these 6 decisions on the right-hand side, and variations on the theme of those things. But I think for those who aren't involved in the process, either as an editorial board member or a peer reviewer or a journal administrative staff member like myself, that process can seem, I think, quite mysterious. So I hope to demystify that a little bit. Now, this next slide, as you can see, is quite busy. There's a lot of information there, and please don't try and write it all down. I've passed on the slides to Leonard and Elizabeth to share with you in due course, but broadly, this kind of slide demonstrates the process and the life cycle within the peer review process, that an author will submit a manuscript to an editorial office for a journal. The editorial office, people like myself, will perform some initial checks on that manuscript for scientific scope, perhaps, make sure that the paper is the right fit for that journal, whether it is seemingly scientifically sound. It may surprise you, it may not, to discover that a number of manuscripts journals receive each year, particularly broad interest scientific journals like myself, my own Royal Society of Open Science, get a number of what you might describe as esoteric and speculative submissions each year that are probably not suitable for publication. So we try to kind of catch those before the paper goes to the next stage of assessment, which is usually assigning to an editor or potentially multiple editors, depending upon the setup of the journal. And the role of the journal, who will generally be a practicing academic at an institution somewhere, will be to perform additional checks, making sure again that the paper is even more specifically within scope, that they can properly check the scientific soundness of the manuscript before it's potentially sent off for peer review. Editors can have a number of titles: board member, associate editor, handling editor, action editor, subject editor, senior editor, section editor. All these things are broadly the same type of individual, say an academic editor who manages the peer review process for a journal. Assuming the paper passes that next step of editorial assessment, the editors will assign a number of potential reviewers to that paper and invite those reviewers to assess the manuscript. Most journals are looking for at least 2 peer review reports from referees or peer reviewers, same people, to make some editorial decision on whether to proceed and how to proceed with the manuscript. Broadly, so we're looking for 2 to make sure those reports are broadly in alignment, and so that the reviewers can provide a sort of consultative report, I suppose you might look at it, to a recommendation to the editors to determine how to proceed. And we'll perhaps talk a little bit about more how that process works in a moment, but reviewers will generally be asked to provide, assuming they agree to review, a combination of kind of up, down, yes, no scores against a number of questions in a peer reviewer score sheet, usually through an electronic management submission management system, and also a degree of free text to explain their decision-making process, why they feel a particular paper should be accepted, revised, or rejected, and so on. Those reports will return to the editors who have been handling the peer review process, and those editors will read the reports, one would hope, and then make some determination about how to proceed with that paper based on not only the peer review reports, but also their own reading of the manuscript. And so in general, that will be either from rejection through revision to acceptance. That decision will be then communicated either directly by the editors or via the editorial office to the author or authors of the manuscript, who will then be invited, if it's a revision, to provide feedback and response and rebuttals and a rebuttal and a modified manuscript for resubmission. This sort of pinkish, purplish red arrow on the right-hand side of the slide there. And assuming the revision is submitted, the paper can go back through that process of initial editorial assessment, editor assessment, further peer review, editorial decision, and further revision, potentially a number of times over the course of that manuscript's life cycle with a particular journal. And the hope for both editors and authors, I think, is that you only go through that process kind of once. You go through submission, through peer review, and acceptance. So you kind of one smooth process. However, the path of true peer review rarely runs smooth, I fear. So that's kind of in a nutshell is how the peer review process looks. But what are the mechanics? What are the mechanisms that kind of support that peer review process? Most journals that are reputable will have some details about the peer review process on their websites, kind of the mechanisms that they adopt, what they're looking for from the peer review process, what peer reviewers should be looking for and doing. It's always worthwhile reading the instructions for reviewers, as well as instructions for authors if you're preparing a manuscript for submission, as I think it allows you to see what the other side are looking for. And you can kind of hopefully tailor your manuscript, your covering letter for the submission to maximize the likelihood of successful publication. But I thought it might be useful just quickly mention that the common approaches of blinding, the common levels of blinding in the peer review process, which I've included 3 examples here at the bottom of the slide: of single blind, double blind, and open peer review, and kind of what that means. So in the single blind process, what generally happens is that papers are submitted. The editors and reviewers of a manuscript, peer reviewers of a manuscript, will know the identities of the authors of a paper. They'll see that in a PDF template or a proof of the manuscript that's been prepared by the journal. But the authors will not know necessarily who the reviewers are. They may know during the kind of the output of the peer review process through the decision letters that authors receive. They may know the identity of the editors, but they won't know the identity of the peer reviewers. In the double-blind process, as the slide rather describes, really, both the authors and reviewers remain anonymous to one another. The reviewers will not know who the authors of the paper are, and vice versa. There's also, just to add an extra level of complexity, there's also a triple blind form of peer review. The editors will not know the identities of the reviewers and authors as well. So it can get kind of quite complicated quite quickly. But the point behind this is that the single blind and double blind will determines how much information different parties have about one another, really. And there is some evidence to suggest that different models of peer review introduce or tackle different levels of bias in the publication process. but there is a lot of kind of contrary evidence as well. This is not totally clear. There's no definitive answer about which form of peer review is best, in inverted commas. There's also the open peer review that's already referred to. And again, there are different ways of doing this. But the way we do it at the Royal Society for a number of our journals, including Royal Society Open Science, is that the process of peer review, the actual kind of assessment phase of peer review, is carried out in a single blind fashion, but the outputs of the peer review process are published in the open. And what we mean by that is that the peer review, substantive parts of the peer review process, the comments of the authors that peer reviewers might supply, the editorial decision letter, and also any author rebuttals that are supplied, are published alongside the completed and accepted paper on our website, or indeed through a third-party service we've been working with called Publons. But as a default, the identities of the peer reviewers remain anonymous, they remain hidden, although we encourage reviewers to waive that right to anonymity. And I think about in Royal Society of Science, something like 20%, I think, of reviewers waive that right and are happy not only for their peer review reports to be published, but also the names to be associated with that report, which is kind of interesting. So those are some of the ways that kind of peer review can operate. Can I persuade this to move forward? I can, jolly good, excellent. But where do peer reviews come from? Many peer reviews or suggestions of peer reviews are provided by authors of papers at the point of submission to a journal. And many journals actually require this. Royal Society of Science began requiring authors to supply their suggested reviewers some years ago. I can talk about the reasons for that kind of in due course, but when you're suggesting reviewers as an author to a journal, it's important that the editor, the authors, the reviewers have the right subject expertise, that they have a good publication record, and that varies a bit from field to field. But also that the people are kind of sufficiently senior, have a good scoping and good experience of the field. And we tend to find that our editors will invite postdoctoral researchers or principal investigators of other groups, or more senior scientists and researchers preferentially over PhD students, for instance. And indeed, we try to avoid PhD students being the sole peer reviewer on a paper, or master students indeed. As I think the general view is that they must be very, very talented. They perhaps haven't have yet the experience to be able to kind of put together a comprehensive peer review report. Now, flip side of that, of course, is how you make sure that PhD students get the experience to write peer review reports. And we've also begun encouraging what we describe as co-review, making sure that PhD students, master students, indeed undergraduate students, work with senior scientists to prepare peer review reports. So making suggestions can be very useful for journals and editors, partly because they provide a pool of potential suitable reviewers to assess the paper in the first instance. And the secondly, perhaps most equally importantly, they give editors like a starting point for their own searches. Most editors will include some mixture when inviting reviewers of author-suggested referees, author-suggested reviewers, suggestions that editorial offices might have provided, and their own kind of editors networks and people they've searched for. And if you can provide good suggestions at the start as an author, that helps the editors kind of cast that net more widely and get more people more quickly to speed up the review process. But it is also important to bear in mind that even if you make really good suggestions, the top people in the field that you're wanting to publish in, editors are not generally obliged to use those suggestions. And there are a number of reasons for that. It could be there's a conflict of interest between the editor or the authors and the referee in some fashion. Perhaps they know each other and have worked with each other very recently and collaborated very recently. Or it may just be that actually they may be great for the paper, or some aspects of the paper, but not necessarily great for all aspects of the paper. And this last point on the slide about making sure that cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary work, that you include multiple suggestions from different aspects of the field is quite important as well, to make sure editors have kind of the widest availability of people to pick from. As I'm conscious that I'm running rapidly out of time, and maybe in fact, as you run out of time, I will power onto my final slide, which is the role of the handling editor. So I've talked a little bit about this kind of earlier on in the process, but I think it's worth just kind of reiterating this. The editors have a number of roles, some of which are identified in the slide here, but ultimately their key role is to determine what is published in a journal. Who is making that determination in terms of the editorial board differs from journal to journal. It might be the editor-in-chief. On this slide, we have a sample from the Proceedings of Royal Society B journal, editorial board from some years ago. So in some journals, people like Spencer Barrett would be making the final decision. In other cases, it might be board members, it might be handling editors, subject editors. So it really depends upon the journal. But that's their key role, is to determine what is published in the journal. And they do that through the assessment of the suitability of paper, as described earlier on, but in terms of scope and so on, scientific soundness, making sure the peer review process is handled appropriately. And negotiating with reviewers and authors if there are issues between them in terms of authors not understanding what reviewers are asking, for instance, during the peer review process, or indeed vice versa. But editors also have a role in terms of post-publication or during the peer review process, making sure that any ethical issues, for instance, are tackled, making sure that if there are potential issues of misconduct, they're investigated with the editorial office as well, to make sure that not only the provenance, but the verification, I suppose, and the reputation of the research is sound and it is appropriate, and there are not problems with it in some fashion, ethically or otherwise. And a sort of final quick point, I suppose, is that the box in the sort of middle right of the screen there, that it is also worth, as well as looking at journal instructions before submitting a paper and looking at the author, review instructions rather, it's also worth looking at the editorial board makeup of a journal to make sure that there are names you perhaps recognize, that they are people who can shepherd your work through the peer review process quickly, comfortably, and to the standard you would expect. And to avoid vastly overrunning, I will stop at that point and simply say that this may be an opportunity for any questions, but also to say that you can get in touch with the Royal Society and the Royal Society publishing team either on Twitter, if you use that form of social media. We're also on Facebook. The royalsociety.org/journals page is our top-level site for all our journals, and also includes details of editorial policies that might be worth looking at. And finally, if you don't want to get in touch with a particular journal, want to ask a general question of us, publishing@royalsociety.org is a fine way of getting in touch. But I will stop there, and if Lena is happy to take any questions at this point, I'm happy to do so, but I'm also happy to wait till after Gerben has done his talk, if that would be preferred.